Please join me in welcoming Robert Brain. Do you need any water or anything?
Yeah, maybe some water.
Okay.
Great, thanks. So, good evening and welcome, and thank you for coming out on this cold, dark, and wet night. Let me thank Dan Adelman, John Beasley Murray, for the invitation to come here and talk to you tonight, especially at this busy and stressful time of year. Tonight I'd like to talk about the quantified self movement, a widespread global movement in which the members self-track all sorts of physiological, psychological, behavioral variables in their lives using instruments and digital technologies. The whole project that they undertake has deep roots, although they don't see it that way. But as a historian, I can't help but see it that way. And I'll talk something about those kinds of roots. But let me just say from the start that the quantified self movement, in its own narrative, was founded in 2007 by Wired magazine founders Kevin Kelly and Gary Wolfe in Kevin Kelly's living room in Pacifica in the Bay Area. It began as a website. Maybe you can advance that. Let's get Kevin Kelly up there. See what he looks like. So it began as a website and grew rapidly into a self-trackers community. The first show and tell, and show and tells I'll talk about a little bit. These are the meetups in which the self-trackers share their projects and results. Had about 30 attendees. As I mentioned, took place in Kelly's Bay Area home. It grew and grew from there. By the year 2010, Gary Wolfe published a manifesto of sorts called The Data-Driven Life, which appeared in the New York Times Magazine in April of that year. By March 2011, there were show and tell groups in 20 cities worldwide. There are now quantified self meetup groups in hundreds of cities around the world, with at least one group on every continent. I think there are 4 or 5 in Canada. There's one in Vancouver. There are also 2 international quantified self conferences, QS Europe and QS Global. And there are also a number of spin-off networks, sort of splinter groups and dissenters and so on. Let's have another one here. Let's see. This is Stephen Wolfram, a British scientist turned entrepreneur who once tried to build a computational knowledge engine called Wolfram Alpha, aimed to challenge Google in promoting, he's turned to promoting what he calls personal analytics. According to the New York Times, 230,000 pages of paper documents, his medical test data, his complete genome, his constant GPS location tracking, room-by-room motion sensor data, all this kind of thing is ready to be analyzed. So he has this full picture of himself kind of emerging from all this kind of data. And yet the biggest payoff, as he notes, is that soon people will watch their health in a way that's a little closer to the way that they watch their financial portfolios. There are a few other people, and I'll just orient you with a couple of the celebrities. It's really made up of the rank and file, but I'll just show you some pictures. This is Tim Ferriss, who basically cashed in and published in a book form and made millions off of a series of books, particularly this one, The 4-Hour Body, which gives you all kinds of self-tracking tools to manage your body and do various things and improve your sex life and lots of other stuff. This is Dave Asprey, best known to the world as the inventor of bulletproof coffee. That's this coffee that's blended with grass-fed butter and medium-chain triglyceride oils, the kind of thing that's found in coconut oil, but in a purified form. This is you eat this with you have this instead of your breakfast. You keep a low-carb diet, a ketogenic diet. It adds brain fuel and so on. It was inspired, Asprey says, by a time in which he was up in the Tibetan high Himalayas and had a special tea with yak butter, and he thought that it helped him cope with the harsh environment particularly well, and so he came up with this idea, and it's quite famous anyway. Anyway, Asprey lives over on Vancouver Island, outside of Victoria. He has a website, he has a podcast with all kinds of interviews. on biohacking. He's a biohacker. Many of these quantified self people call themselves biohackers, the ones who are interested particularly in their biology, hacking their diet. He has all sorts of materials on hacking your diet, hacking your sleep, hacking your habits, brain functions, heart rate variability, psychedelic drug experiences, and much, much more. He also sells all the equipment to do all this with, as well as dietary supplements like the one here, the GABA wave product that helps your brain function. And a new one that came out, I learned on his website, that's called Unfair Advantage. This captures the kind of Silicon Valley mentality. He's a Silicon Valley entrepreneur who's given up his company to do this kind of thing full time. Well, at its most banal, quantified self simply involves people tracking their weight or their cholesterol or their sleep in relationship to different lifestyle variables using their Fitbit and other devices. But for others, it's a much more kind of revolutionary undertaking. In the language of Silicon Valley, it's disruptive, the favorite kind of term for what you're supposed to be. It's anti-authority. It's often kind of linked up with a kind of anarcho-libertarian rhetoric favored by Silicon Valley types. In some cases, it's linked up with the Occupy movement, and one quantified self-writer called it Occupy Science and Medicine, and linked it up with the kind of citizen science. Biohacking is kind of citizen science, taking it away from kind of big biomedical authorities and that kind of thing. Well, my interest in quantified self has several sources, and it's something, what I'm really presenting to you tonight, it's the first time I've ever tried to pull any thoughts together about it, but I've kind of been tracking it on the internet for several years with a sense of kind of puzzlement and wonder. Part of what I'm interested in is thinking about quantified self as a window onto the larger phenomenon of Silicon Valley. For some time I've been both puzzled and concerned that critical intellectuals don't turn enough attention to Silicon Valley and the world it's making. As Evgeny Morozov, one of the few people out there outside of Silicon Valley who's put Silicon Valley to critical analysis, points out, he puts it, you think about big pharma, big oil, the mere fact that we have used the term big to talk about them means that we figured out that they probably have interests that diverge from those of the public. Nobody uses the term big data in that sense. So we might think about Silicon Valley. I like to think about this question of Silicon Valley in light of Karl Marx and what he might have thought about it. Karl Marx, of course, insisted that to understand the capitalist mode of production in the 19th century, one had to look hard in its epicenter in Manchester. Here's a picture of, oops, is that sideways? No, it's not this way. Marx sketching for himself a steam engine, just as sort of part of understanding how steam engines work and so on, to understand the kind of technology. But he also paid close attention to the mores and social practices of the capitalist culture in Manchester. And I think we ought to apply some of the same attitude to understanding the mode of production in our own time in its epicenter in Silicon Valley. And it's probably worth reflecting for a second on why we don't critique Silicon Valley more, especially since it's not an industry known for self-critique. In the eternal sunshine of the tech entrepreneurs' minds, skeptical challenges are met with bewilderment and usually then a blithe dismissal of Luddism on the part of all their critics, with little awareness that the Luddites were a serious political movement responding to serious political issues, or that Luddism has a very respectable intellectual pedigree, and most importantly, that Luddism isn't even necessarily opposed to technology at all. Silicon Valley has its in-house intellectuals, of course, like Jason Lanier or Clay Shirky, both of whom sometimes have interesting things to say, but often seem way too close to the business to ask certain kinds of questions. And then there are people like Peter Thiel, the billionaire founder of PayPal, turned venture capitalist, turned philosopher, who has a philosophy degree and a law degree from Stanford and can dress up his discussions of business plans and techno-libertarianism with quotations from René Girard and Kant, thereby dazzling his many acolytes. So in the philosophically blind Silicon Valley, the one-eyed philosophers are kings. But sometimes it seems to me that the reluctance on the part of people like us to criticize Silicon Valley stems from the fact that they're too much like us. That is, the critical educated community, urbanites, academics, and so on. University folk are notoriously averse to turning their critical eye to their own kind. Witness the unease around the recent historians' discoveries that elite US universities owe their huge endowments to capital endowments to the 19th century slave trade, and how everyone doesn't want to talk about this kind of thing. More tellingly, I think Silicon Valley companies are, so many of them, university spin-offs. And they cultivate a campus-like atmosphere with casual dress, frisbees, and ping pong, and completely blurring the line between work and play. And after all, we know people in tech, all of us. Some of them were our friends at university, or our students, or some of us might even say to ourselves, there, but for better mathematical abilities go I. So this lack of technical ability no doubt inhibits or intimidates some of us. How can I criticize the industry when I don't even write code or don't understand how a microprocessor works? Well, I think that technical abilities surely matter for some kinds of critique, but probably less often than we might think. Historians of technology observe how machines embody social values, and this is especially true for the technologies designed in Silicon Valley. Countless new apps are thorough embodiments of the lifestyle and values of the techies of the area, which leads us to the quantified self-movement. To this end, I want to take up a couple of terms coined by Morozov, they're up here already, to describe the kind of wider ethos of Silicon Valley, described in his splendid book, To Save Everything, Click Here. And one of these is what he calls technological solutionism. And this is simply the idea that we should recast our problems from political gridlock to weight loss as things that should be solved primarily through technological efficiency. Whenever I sort of read him talking about this, I think of a joke that I once heard in Italy a long time ago. A room full of Americans and Italians. And the Italian told the joke, and the joke was, what does an American think you're supposed to do with a problem? And everybody waited for the answer, and he said, the answer was, solve it. And the Italians rolled on the floor to a person who were beside themselves with hilarity. And the Americans were sitting there completely puzzled. You know, isn't that what you're supposed to do? And the gulf in mentality couldn't have been wider. So there's a bit of, this is the most extreme version of that kind of thing. Technological solutionism is usually accompanied by a serious disdain for the way that other sectors do things and confront their problems. All those old regime institutions who haven't learned that all problems are solvable by better information or more computational capacity. And those of you who have been following the meltdown in the US of the century-old magazine, The New Republic, last week, recently purchased by Facebook co-founder Chris Hughes, will have seen an excellent exhibition of this problem, in this case trying to run a magazine like a tech company, and it led to, in this case, a revolt by the editorial staff and probably the end of the New Republic, at least as we know it in some sense. And this extends to all kinds of problems, this tech solutionism. World hunger, we can make an app for that. It sounds like an exaggeration, but it's not really in a way. The second of Morozov's terms is internet centrism, and these are ideas, of course, that are kind of ubiquitously found among Silicon Valley types, and this has certainly been my experience. I come from that area. I'm familiar with the kinds of people who work there. This is the idea. Internet centrism is the idea that we're living in uniquely revolutionary times in which previous truths no longer hold. The era of big data changes everything, and all the old rules are off. And so these two ideas, the kind of disdain for the institutions and this idea of something absolutely revolutionary, so that everything that one might have known is suspended and probably irrelevant. So they capture both of these terms, tech solutionism and internet centrism, are mantras that are often heard, or they express the kind of thing that are heard around quantified self people as well, who believe, very often one hears that they're developing a new model of the self for our age. An empowered and libertarian self, decoupled from all conventional forms of authority, sometimes even decoupled from one's own bodily senses, and linked to a larger kind of authority of data. So, my thesis, the one thing I want to talk about here, diverges into a conceptually simple but socially complex alternative reading that more likely quantified self is amplifying and consolidating a self that's already been produced elsewhere. In this case, I want to argue that it's been produced over several decades by the pharmaceutical industry. And it's a self that we all share, or we're all kind of being herded into, and perhaps we're already kind of well into it to a certain degree, but they're amplifying it and kind of carrying it along. So it's not an invention of 2007, and it has deeper roots than that I'll talk about as well. So let me talk a little more about some quantified self stuff. So as I mentioned, show and tells, these kinds of show and tells are the heart of the quantified self communities. They're the events at which members of local quantified self communities give short presentations about their self-tracking projects and field questions from the audience. The format is informal, though many speakers use slides. The narratives are based around answering questions, basic questions. What did you do? That is, what did you quantify? How did you do it? And what did you learn? And so on. And the kinds of things that people do are, I couldn't begin to kind of count them all, but here's some basic ideas. Here's a graph of 26 years of weight tracking. And I love the lines that came with this. When I look at this, this is the story of my life in these years, in this data, as the person tells us. So weight tracking is, of course, perhaps the most common single variable tracked, and we can all understand why. So this is a heart variability monitor. So sometimes these measures go into kind of physiological phenomena. Maybe the next one here. So heart variability sort of measures the kind of heartbeat, and the issue is that when one is under stress, different kinds, or in ill health, the heart begins to kind of beat in a kind of very regular, consistent way. What you want is a kind of very inconsistent, fluctuating, kind of chaotic, fractal-like kind of pattern. So here's somebody measuring his stress during a full session with a coworker, stress during a free session with a colleague, going into the kinds of results and so on. I saw another one where somebody measured their heart rate variability during a marriage proposal. And tracked the kind of intensity of their, this kind of thing. These things that these people won't do. So this is another interesting one, from the sublime to the ridiculous, quantifying one's excretions, poos and pees, over a certain amount of time, under a variety of different kinds of circumstances, all this kind of thing. People quantify, of course, athletic performance is, of course, a big one in all of its forms in relationship to diet and sleep patterns, sleep itself, and all kinds of things that one can do, taking melatonin, blocking out the light, all the things that you can do to kind of tamper with sleep would come in, how much kind of protein you eat, how much carbohydrate you eat, all these different sorts of things. Let's see, what do we have? And of course, so sometimes people are using very sophisticated equipment. Sometimes people are using these kinds of apps that are now proliferating that can be found on sort of most standard smartphone kits. This is a standard Fitbit with a screenshot. Here measuring your steps, your calories burned, food plan, and so on. There are, one could spend hours here just kind of tracking all the things that people track. But that's really kind of not my primary interest. What's the next one? Oh, right, let's go back. Right there. Okay, so how to account for all of this? Well, in the manifesto that I mentioned by Gary Wolfe, he identified 4 factors that explain this meteoric rise of self-tracking in the late 2000s. First, he said electronic sensors shrank in size and became more powerful. Second, once they enter our smartphones, they become ubiquitous. Third, social media, from Facebook to Twitter, made sharing seem normal. Fourth, the idea of cloud computing made it possible and acceptable to offload one's data onto distant servers where, merged with the data of other users, it could be expected to yield better results. And this, of course, gave rise to a whole range of apps. Well, actually, let me say first, Wolf doesn't put it this way, but when he talks about it, I've actually paraphrased this. He writes of the rise of a global superintelligence known as the cloud. So there's a kind of, I don't know, monistic mysticism here, techno-mysticism that's informing the way he talks about it. And this is interesting too, and we're speaking of the kind of mentalities and mores of Silicon Valley. We shouldn't forget that to the extent that Silicon Valley has intellectual traditions, and Kelly's a representative of them, I think, many of them, like him, have their roots in late 60s, early 70s communes, and the Whole Earth catalog as a symbol, and Steve Jobs points to it as the sort of as a touchstone for everything that he did subsequently, and so on and so forth. So some of these people wax quite mystical about their data and have this kind of a certain kind of fuzzy mysticism about it. Speaking of these kinds of this automatic offloading, though, I can't fail to mention the rise of a number of apps that will do this automatically. So you weigh yourself. There's bathroom scales you can step on every morning, and it automatically sends your data to the cloud to be shared with other users. So a whole lot of things. So you can kind of automate your self-quantification in conjunction with others. So you don't even have, there's no labor, tedious labor involved. So in any case, sharing and cloud aspects are particularly important. Revealing one's own measurements can provide additional motivation while also fostering a sense of community. Of course, you may have noticed, and this is very typical, that Wolf's 4 factors list explains only the technological infrastructure that has made mass-scale self-tracking possible. It's not a question of values or mentalities, but simply one of technological capacity. So he can space that over a couple of years, 10 years or so, or 15 years, as a run-up to 2010, 2007, and so on. And crucially, his account emphasizes the unique ways in which self-tracking and quantification more broadly can help us avoid subjectivity and emotion. He says this: we tolerate the pathology that is quantification. You try and distract with a mechanical type of knowledge because the results were so powerful. Numbering things allows tests, comparisons, and experiments. Numbers makes problems less resonant emotionally, but more tractable intellectually. This is a constant theme, the kind of keeping emotions at bay. One of the things that immediately struck me when I started reading this sort of thing, as a kind of alternative community, and in the Bay Area, as a kind of successor to kind of New Age kind of groups of the 1970s and 80s in my youth, it couldn't be more opposite. The kind of fervency with which kind of any form of psychological experience is kind of rejected, if it can't be quantified, is really striking. The quality of those earlier movements was reveling in the kind of fuzzy subjectivity of certain kinds of experience. Anyway, I'll come back to reflect on all of this again in a moment. But at this point, I want to offer a couple of thoughts towards a genealogy of the quantified self that would emphasize not so much the technology, but rather the ethos behind it. We all are familiar with Foucault's writings on the technologies of self, and I think they're relevant here. The thought that on the one hand, there are traditions of care for the self that go back to the Greeks, cultivation of the art of existence, and Stoic and Epicurean philosophy, for example. And Foucault wrote about this as sort of generating a kind of ethics that he described as a kind of the relation of the self to itself, and with the question, or with respect to the free moral subject as its decisive kind of factor. Foucault made a sharp distinction between this idea of the self and the idea of the subject, which he claimed really enters in with science, which for him actually means Cartesianism, 17th century, something like that. Other people have taken up Foucault's model and charted different kinds of selves coming into being and passing away. I particularly like the work of a historian, the historian Jan Goldstein from Chicago, who describes a kind of post-revolutionary self in France developed by Victor Cousin and a number of other people, a philosophical idea that became institutionalized, that kind of sort of marks 19th century kind of French bourgeois culture. Both Foucault and Goldstein insist that I've already said this, sorry. Okay. We can find many other examples of attempts to quantify our bodies, minds, and habits. Very familiar example of Benjamin Franklin. Franklin was, of course, among other things, a scientist who conducted experiments with electricity, very important ones. And like most 18th century physicists, he saw nature as a kind of steady state system and something that could be measured using double entry bookkeeping. Very simple form of kind of quantified record keeping. In his autobiography, he simply extended the same method to the rest of his life. What applied to electricity applied to the budget, applied to the tracking of the virtues in his language. So here's his self-tracking charts. I won't go into this, but he charts a range of virtues, and this is one for temperance, sort of the degree to which he observed temperance and didn't, and so on. Max Weber, you may of course know Max Weber's famous analysis of all of this when he said, somewhat sneeringly, this is the spirit of capitalism that here speaks in and through Franklin. If you really like this Franklin's Technologies of Virtue, there's an app for that. It's available on Android. Quantified self has important precursors in the 19th century as well, with the rise of physiological and psychological laboratories stocked with instruments that allowed scientists to measure all sorts of bodily intensities. Here I make a shameless plug for my own forthcoming book that deals with this subject, but I mention it because it's quite relevant here. This is where part of what interests me is that many of the technologies that people are using in the quantified self movement are very similar to the kinds of things that people were using in the 19th century, that physiologists and psychologists were using. These were analog devices. There's several examples of devices, and there are more. We can see another. Actually, let's go back. That's just it. That track physiological variables, the pulse, respiration, various things like this. These devices are mechanical and analog. The modern ones are electronic and digital, although they have analog interfaces. So they're able to store them and communicate them and do all the things that one can do with digital information. But the idea of this kind of tracking, of course, is as old as the mid-19th century. My work on this kind of thing moves from this kind of study of these kinds of bodily states, the way that they were used to study bodily states under a variety of circumstances. They were medical instruments used to diagnose disease pathologies as abnormal rhythms, patterns in the curves, and so on. Many 19th century scientists, to the extent that these instruments were portable and usable in these circumstances, carried them around with them in their pockets, would measure them when they were stressed and under various kinds of circumstances. They would also take the curves and mail them to their friends, just see, and they even treated it in some letters, often like a kind of personal autograph or a signature or a kind of silhouette in the Victorian sense of the term, as a kind of little token, a trace of their selfhood in an interesting way. The other thing about these, and the thing that interests me most about them, is the way that artists were particularly interested in this kind of work in the late 19th century. Scientists have been doing work not only on measuring bodily reactions when people were flushed with emotion or anger or various kinds of things, or while listening to Wagner, to a Wagnerian opera, but all this kind of work interested artists who took them up as a way to rethink artworks as media, that is, no matter what the art, so painting or poetry or even music in some instances, as artworks as media that both materialized and remediated rhythms and pulsatile intensities. And my primary argument in that work is that early modernism, from the 1880s to the First World War roughly, hinged on this appropriation of physiological experimentation, this rethinking of what the artwork can do. It started with the notion that the truth of art, that is to say, how art compels its effects on the beholder, could be identified in the material and quantitative properties of the artwork, and how they acted on the psychophysiological sensorium. But the artwork itself was, in some sense, a projection of the psychophysiology of the artist, consolidated in the work of art in a somewhat calculated way, and then acted then upon the beholder in ways that were somewhat calculable in a certain sense. So it was a quick and efficient way to produce effective art. These artists also shared a disdain for conventions and traditions of art up to that point. It meant, for example, that poets began to measure the voice as a set of curves, and to throw away principles of rhythm and meter and replace them with the shape of a vocal curve like these. This is a person vocalizing Sanskrit phonemes, and they did the similar kinds of things. This is part of a 900-page book full of graphs where people recorded the entire French canon of Alexandrine poetry, so the idea was to understand what the kind of outside of rhythm and measure, rhythm and meter, the kind of formal principles, that there was a kind of hidden, underlying kind of data, kind of physiological reality that was different from what the canons actually said. There were laboratories in Paris that were kind of busy with this, and these avant-garde artists and poets passed through them. Most famously, one of the passers through from abroad was Ezra Pound, who took these techniques and introduced them into English poetry. So you get really the beginnings of free verse poetry in the English language this way comes from this. And it spreads throughout, these techniques spread throughout the world in various ways. And they correspond with what people were doing in painting as well. So the idea amongst these artists was that artworks could operate subliminally and powerfully on the psychophysiology of spectators, but also this had a very strong, for many of these people, a very strong political objective. These people, a good many of them, and the French ones in particular, were Kropotkinist anarchists who thought the artwork could be a way to physiologically calibrate communities, make people kind of pulse to a different rhythm. And they tried to kind of invent rhythms, usually borrowed from cabarets and that sort of thing, to kind of counteract the kind of established rhythms of society and so on. So it was a form of kind of, it was conceived of as a certain physiological model of revolution in these kinds of artworks. The disappearance of this kind of thing has a kind of long and complicated history in and through and after the First World War. Some of it goes into fascist aesthetics, some of it goes in other places. It's a complicated story. It's a story to be told someplace else. My main point in telling you all of this is to simply stress that the account of quantified self that focuses on the machinery and looks away from everything else that goes into the machines, I think is highly misleading. That you can see that these machines in many ways are very, very similar to the ones that we have today, minus the digital capacities. And yet the ideology behind them, the things that people thought that they were able to do with them, is extremely different. And so I want to sort of take it away from the kind of implicit technological determinism that surrounds quantified self and most of what goes on in Silicon Valley, and make this a kind of exploration of ideology and of values. So the importance of quantified self is not the gadgets, despite the fact that they're a necessary condition of quantified self practice, and of course highly fetishized by quantified self practitioners. In my opinion, it's really the ideological context of the practice that really frames it in important ways. Well, it's seldom said, but ever present, I think, in QS reports that the notion that with better data, our one true self will emerge out of the noise. It's the self that's trying to get out. It's the self that's trying to tell its story. But it's constantly being obscured by, well, too much data, too much noisy data. But better gadgets, cleverer methods for tracking all of our wants, fears, and desires will reveal that self in all of its rational glory, making our actions rational. And in that sense, the self that emerges looks a lot like the ideal decision-making scenario in the corporate boardroom: better data, clearer vision, better decisions. Unfair advantage. That's what you're striving for. It's a model of the self that can be perpetually empowered to thrive and compete more effectively. So the ideological statements of most of the quantified self gurus are a kind of mixture of business plan utopianism and Wired magazine anarcho-libertarianism, the creation of self-empowering anti-authority individuals. But what I want to argue is that they have really enlisted big data to implement a kind of self-analytics that's already been well established elsewhere, and that we have already created a kind of a data self in our time, and it's largely been created by medicine, and particularly by big pharma. The story goes something like this. Beginning in the 1970s, medicine underwent a dramatic change. It's probably always been the case that, except for hypochondriacs, people only went to doctors when they were ill. Illness was an interruption of normal life, and doctors retreated from the picture once health was restored. But beginning in the 1970s, a new model of medical care was introduced that involved continual management of critical markers of health, like blood pressure, cholesterol levels, and a steadily growing number of biomarkers, that is, measures of underlying physiological states for all sorts of things. And the reasons for this are several, but probably one of the most important things was the presence of long-term studies, like the Framingham Heart Study done in the United States, following the population of a small New England town over several decades, that traced the habits of people, of the population, and particularly with a focus on the effects of all these different variables on people's cardiovascular health. The result of this, and this kind of data and this vision that was brought in, was essentially a kind of public health model that imported into clinical medicine, and clinical medicine became risk management, essentially. It was aided, so the point was then to sort of manage one's risk over a long-term perspective, rather than a kind of short-term interventional model of medicine. This view that began to emerge in the 1970s and out of the Framingham was aided and abetted by pharmaceutical companies who realized very quickly that a system of medicine based on the management of patients' numbers offered opportunities to put patients on lifetime pharmaceutical management, whereas the anthropologist Joe Dumas puts it on drugs for life. So people without symptoms would be treated with reference to numbers drawn from tests. And that model, in short, has become the basis for a range of medications, from statin drugs for cholesterol, beta blockers for other kinds of heart conditions, SSRIs for mood disorders and depression, metformin for management of blood sugar, and countless other things, and diabetes, and countless other kind of smaller scale but yet important drugs. So in the early phases, when this form of medicine was getting going in the 1970s, it was a matter of teaching patients to think of medicine and in a new way. And there were campaigns exhorting the public to know your numbers. Know your numbers. There were know your numbers campaigns. And by the 1990s, in the United States, pharmaceutical companies began to combine this with direct-to-consumer advertising aimed at inducing fear in patients. We've all seen these kinds of ads on US television. The model of medicine as managed fear, that you plant the fear, you kind of induce people to go through their doctor. Sometimes there's a slight sense that the doctor is the enemy that has to be overcome, depends on the drug. That's particularly common with the antidepressants. In any case, there's a kind of exhortation to know your numbers, but from a kind of standpoint of paranoia in some sense, I would argue. On the other hand, this model pushes one to be a better educated, proactive patient, to become an expert in one's own health, ideally to be equal to one's doctor or better in some cases, a step ahead than one's doctor by knowing one's numbers, by having a kind of complete set. The kind of people, and all the reports that I've read, that Silicon Valley types, when they go to their doctor, bring an Excel spreadsheet with all their data, and they lay it all out, and say, these are my cholesterol numbers, these are my, the whole thing. And those doctors kind of are a little overwhelmed when they see all this. In any case, so the 70s Know Your Numbers campaign becomes, with Quantified Self, really know your numbers, and so on. So the interest I have in this then is so that Quantified Self reproduces this subject position of the expert patient with an added rhetoric of empowerment, of liberation, of freedom from authority, particularly in this case, medical authority. And again, it embodies the solutionist model, produce more data, and it might produce more data, and it will cast more light on the problem. Well, when I look at so many of these different things, it's quite clear that in many cases there is genuine light thrown on some of these kinds of problems. One does learn things with these kinds of analytics, but it raises. So I'm not here to kind of deride the project in high, but it raises a kind of fundamental issue, a real quandary as far as I'm concerned, for the value of this kind of thing, and it falls into the category of what Foucault called ethics. That is, what's the relationship of the self to the self? What's the relationship of the self to the self when to plunge into this kind of data the plunge into this kind of data is predicated on a model of managed fear, a certain kind of paranoia. I wish I had the slide. Andy Grove, who's former Intel CEO, recounted a story in his book. His book is called "Only the Paranoid Survive," and again, Silicon Valley. But he recounts the discovery of elevated numbers for prostate-specific antigen, the sort of measure, the kind of rough measure of a general question that there might be, that there's something going on with the prostate. We'll put it that way. It doesn't indicate it's not a foolproof measure of prostate cancer, but it's an indication that there might be an issue. And then he tells the story about getting deeper into the issue and all of the complicated variables and kind of false positives and false negatives, and it's kind of a big mess. He goes into the research and he finds that deep into the kind of academic scientific research, he finds that it's kind of also completely a mess. That it's a dilemma of dilemmas, and he's kind of way out ahead of everything else on this kind of story, and he's kind of driving himself absolutely crazy for several years. And he recounts this in his memoir. This kind of thing. This kind of very smart, data-driven figure. Not a member of the Quantified Self community, but a perfect example of the kind of paradox of selfhood that goes with this subject position, I think. So in this kind of case, computational capacity, expert knowledge might not be an answer. It might be the opposite of an answer. It might kind of give rise to a kind of an open-ended kind of plunge into chronic fear, paranoia, and so on. So there's a kind of maybe an aporia of empowerment here. Is this a quagmire of managed fear, or is it empowerment through self-control? Some people have criticized the Quantified Self movement on the grounds that they're busy producing data to be used by pharmaceutical companies and all these kinds of people. Personally, I don't think that's the big problem, although it can be when you think about issues like 23andMe, the company that was founded by the ex-wife of one of the Google founders, that wanted to put essentially the whole world's genomic information up with kind of Google analytical capacities. The Food and Drug Administration stepped in and kind of put a stop to it, although they've come to Canada in recent months And it's not clear that the Canadian government is going to act to stop them. So they may have Canadian data, but not other places. But I don't think that's the biggest kind of problem. I think it's really fundamentally a kind of this aporia of fear or self-management that the quantitative self movement gives rise to. And that's all I have. So put on the table for discussion here.
So we've got a ballpark of 20 minutes for questions and conversation, after which time we will be adjourning to the Railway Club. And if you mention Am's name, Am Johal, you don't have to pay cover. Also, just before adjourning, we're going to play a quick presentation from Steve Collis, who is our 2014 year-end indoctrinator. As many of you know, we're not allowed to give out certificates, but we do honor a special person, usually a professor, every term. And our indoctrinator for this term is Steve Collis, who many of you know through his activism on Burnaby Mountain. And so he's going to Skype in after we're done with the Q&A, and we'll put the chairs away and go to the Railway Club. So yeah, if anyone has any questions, just raise your hand.
What was the word that you used? You said aporia?
Yeah, I mean, we'll just call it a paradox then. Yeah, just yeah. Yeah.
Well, thanks for the great talk. Doug told me you were a great lecture and didn't disappoint. And I think it's a very timely talk because 2014 to 2015, a lot of these things have gone from fringe to mainstream
Yes.
three movements. Intel got basis,
Mm-hmm.
and the basis surge will come out with 6 sensors,
Mm-hmm.
your perspiration, your heart rate, body temperature, and that's Intel, right?
Yeah.
Apple
Yeah.
Watch is coming out
Mhm.
early 2015, and Google Android, of course.
Yes.
Samsung is out, Moto is out. So all these things are coming out in 2015 with the optical sensors.
Yes.
And one of the big questions is who is going to own the data once it goes in the cloud? And insurance companies, of course, would be very interested in this.
Yes.
I mean, imagine if you have a lawsuit, workers' comp, you can't walk, and your Apple Watch says, you know, you've been doing 3-4K a day, right? So there's a lot of ethical, judicial issues that are going to come up in the next few years.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all this, I mean, I have this feeling that all this data is going to be gathered one way or the other because, you know, our world is full of sensors and that will only multiply exponentially. So I don't know how people are going to be able to contain this data and keep it out of the hands of...
Well, it is big data now. It's not alternative anymore. And
Yeah,
it will be
yeah,
more so.
yeah.
Because Apple is, you know, what's more mainstream than Apple and Google and Intel,
Yeah.
right?
No, that's right, and I guess so. Because you know, as much as I would like to see a way to fight it, I mean, people can put up fights, and they should, to try and restrict it as much as possible. But I think these companies will get their hands on you know, enough data to work with pretty easily. So to me, the question is, how can individuals be? How can we comport ourselves to this? You know, should we be complicit? How should we see it? How should we, in some sense, the quantified self problem kind of opens out on how we ought to think about our own self data, our own selves as data in this kind of way.
Well, there will have to be legal issues that come out of who owns the data, which is
Yeah.
it's very similar to Touch ID in the new iPhones. So, for example, if you have a password code, the police cannot force you to put the password in if you're arrested to look at the data on your phone. But if you have a fingerprint ID, the police can force you to put your finger on and open your phone. So this is a very legal
Yeah.
issue that's coming out.
Yeah,
It'll
sure,
be very
yeah.
similar, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, yeah. No, that's
There
an
will be all
issue.
new laws coming up with all these things, right?
Yeah, and it's going to be very hard for the law to keep up with
Yeah,
all
for
this.
example, the new Fitbit Surge has a GPS in it. So if you were in a murder case and the GPS is on the cloud, and where were you at a certain time, who owns that?
Yeah.
You know, will the police be able to access that GPS
Yeah,
data, right?
yeah. It all scares me. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't, yeah. Yeah, John.
Yeah, I'm interested in the, I've got two questions, I guess, both quick. The first, the kind of switch between public health and individual health, right? So between sort of, large-scale surveys and measurements, for instance, on infants or mammograms and so on and so forth, which are public health projects, which are sort of socialized and generally, I guess we think are good things. And on the other hand, this kind of unfair advantage rhetoric, which you're talking about, right, which is all about a much more sort of Hobbesian, right, antisocial, right, world, you know. And it's interesting, the grey area, right, I think is part of what you're talking about. So that's the first thing. And the second thing, very quick, is I wonder why, however, you're putting so much emphasis on health and not taking up on the suggestion by somebody you quoted that we should think of ourselves, we should look at these statistics like we once looked at, or we were supposed to look at our stock options or whatever. In other words, how much money and finance and the discourse around controlling your own finance and being prudent and so on, and investing well fits into or influences this kind of discourse.
Yeah, so I mean the first issue, that's really interesting. Both of those are interesting points. The first issue, the transfer of the public health model, is something that kind of happened without people noticing so much. I mentioned the point of the Framingham studies. These are essentially epidemiological studies, and they cast individual health in terms of, as epidemiologists do, in terms of a statistical community, and track these kind of individual variables. But it also joined forces with the people who were advocating this, got a lot of kind of wind behind their back from the anti-tobacco campaigns which were also public health issues. So there was a kind of, it provided a model for a kind of intervention in public habits and personal habits, the sort of joining up with what came to be seen as a good cause in this sense. And it produces a kind of model where, on the one hand, individuals are cast entirely within these statistical communities. That individuality is a place on a continuum or in a statistical population. And so are each of your biomarkers. You're kind of an amalgam of these things. So, what constitutes the kind of range of cholesterol values, and then a decision about what's considered kind of high risk and low risk and all this kind of thing. The paradox to my mind is that this kind of this model of medicine is a model that places the subject squarely in a kind of statistical model, and yet it's being treated as though within the framework of individual actors in the quantified self as a kind of heightened individualism, as a kind of empowered individualism, when all they're doing in some sense is kind of defining their place within a statistical community a little more forcefully, in some sense. Is that what you're? Is that?
That's the kind of paradox or tension that is kind of interesting, and in some ways it's a misreading of statistics, right? Because these large-scale surveys are about general social trends and probabilities, and they always say, well, we can't say anything about individuals, right? None of this.
Right.
And yet they're being taken as ways in which you can sort of game the system. But that again leads me to the second question, which is, it's this attempt to beat the market, and right? And yet being part of the market at the same time.
Well, that's right. So on the one hand, yeah, you're absolutely right. Well, and added to this is the institution of randomized clinical trials. In other words, there's a whole set of things that constitute what people now call evidence-based medicine, which codify this and set a certain kind of standard of rigor. But really, it's giving rigor to exactly what the kind of a picture of rigor to this kind of model. But really, what you're saying essentially is that you're at a statistical risk. It's not. It constrains the kind of. And doctors, in some cases, particularly in say in the U.S., where they're highly constrained often by insurance companies and what they can prescribe and how they can treat, and they have to treat according to the kind of numbers. So there's a decreasing, diminishing kind of room for discretion and other kinds of variables being brought into it. And of course, it's from that standpoint, to the extent that this is driven by pharmaceutical companies, and to a very large extent it is, of course it's all about profit. It's all about generating a kind of a business model for a kind of massive amounts of profit. When individuals take it up, it's very interesting. I mean, part of what you're suggesting is individuals then align themselves with this model and then track their own personal, their habits become kind of investments in a kind of, in a future measured against risk. So that everything you do, every move you make potentially, certainly everything you eat and how much sleep you get every night and how much alcohol you drink and everything becomes a kind of, as Franklin would have it, a kind of set of debits and credits against a model of long-term risk. And I guess that's an investor's model. I don't know that much about investing, but that's the way I assume. When I hear business students in the cafes discussing their exams, like this time of year, that sounds like what they're talking about to me when they discuss hedging and all that kind of stuff.
I guess a more historical question. Could you do the analogy between the early 20th century France and what's going on today? I was talking about the physiological parallels. So I'm just wondering.
Oh, divergences.
I guess the technological parallels, but philosophical divergencies. So I'm
Yeah,
just wondering
yeah.
how much does the Cold War have to do with that divergence? Because especially the idea of managing risk and the idea of the individual actor as a rational entity that can be controlled through modeling of their behavior and understanding their behavior and controlling it through this, I guess, data-driven analysis. That's very much sounds like cybernetics, and it very much sounds like, especially the efforts to control nuclear war through the use of models of human behavior, which you could use to supplement actual human behavior, which would be irrational.
Yeah.
So you can force people to be rational. How much do you see a parallel with that change? So I guess my question is that part of the reason for the philosophical difference or the philosophical divergence from what was happening in the early 20th century?
That's really good, and I agree with you. What I'd say about this is that although these models, the basic statistical models are already there in the late 19th century, Kedley and these kinds of things, these kind of ways of thinking about that, they don't converge with the kind of work that I'm doing. That is to say, people don't take that kind of physiological data and treat it statistically for the most part. They don't array that kind of information in statistical communities in the way that people start to do in the Second World War and then especially in the kinds of large scale models and computer models. That's all a kind of mid-20th century social science that tries to do that kind of thing. So that those earlier physiological models are kind of extrapolations of individuals and not put in any rigorous way against a quantitative whole. And they tend to talk about this all the time. I mean, people like Gabriel Tard writes a whole theory of society as physiological imitation, basically hysteria. Society is hysterical. Human beings unconsciously imitate one another. That is to say, the physiological rhythms of one person are kind of unconsciously taken up by the next person, and it ripples through society, and everybody's kind of, it's very French, right? You have to think of people behaving in very standardized kinds of ways. But that's the way, it's an extrapolation or a kind of contagion of a kind of individualized phenomenon. And what you're talking about is a different thing, yeah.
But I mean, that would account for why that sort of physiological, that interpretation would allow for revolution. Whereas this use of physiological data doesn't really, it allows for control, which is very different.
That's right, yeah, absolutely, yeah, that's a good point, absolutely, yeah, no, that's well put, yeah. I think there was a hand here, and then we'll go back there. How's that? Yeah.
My comment was riffing off of the second part of your comment. And sorry, this is really formal related, but to talk about taking stock and sort of investments and stuff in a more broader kind of social way. Like, I'm really concerned about what will happen when the biomarker technology, biometrics, are used to read other people. Like if I'm wearing a camera and my camera now has face recognition,
Yeah.
I can detect tiny movements in another person. I would be able to say, this is so-and-so, and this is how they feel about whatever it is I'm showing them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember reading 15 years ago, once identity cards were being handed out in Great Britain, how basically, they were already kind of looking ahead to, and I probably already here and already there, that once people had those kinds of photographs of people, that people could be sitting in a town square, with tracking things, and they could simply be identifying everybody in this town square and pulling up all the other kinds of data that if you had access to it in principle. So, it's all, I mean, if it's not here, it's kind of effectively here. Is that what you mean, or is there something more that you?
Yeah, I mean, I was hoping you could speak to it a bit more, but so.
To what this would mean when, I mean, from the standpoint of self-quantification, I don't know, actually. I haven't thought about it. Do you have any, where are you? I'm trying to figure out where you're going with this.
I'm not really sure where to start myself.
Yeah, I have to think about it, yeah.
Within the quantitative self movement, or at least amongst its quote-unquote thought leaders, are there anxieties over the commercialization of the data people have been
Yes.
collecting to this point, or its incorporation into the criminal law process?
Yeah, there is. There is, and there's a kind of discussion and a faction that kind of derisively calls certain people quantrepreneurs, people who are interested in kind of in profiting from this kind of thing. I mean, it's very interesting because the enormous number of people participating in this are working in the data industry. Not everybody, of course, but quite a lot of people. But there is a kind of concern, but it's not universally shared, and it's argued about and so on. Yeah, the answer is yeah. And it's part of the thing that strikes me over and over again is just how there are people in this world who think about these things, but there's an enormous number of people who just don't want to think about ethical and political questions. And they don't want to think that these kinds of technology has ethical or political implications. And it's a kind of cover for just doing whatever they want, making money in their way. And then there are people who do. Some of the people aren't terribly well equipped to think about these kinds of things. It's not the way they're educated. It's one of the reasons why I'm interested in kind of stepping in and looking at this a little more closely, because it's not. I'll go back and then forward. But, yeah.
I'm just curious if you could speak a little bit to the question of politics. And I feel like one of my concerns when we start talking about technological selves and also, this question of the quantified self, what kind of selves are permitted to be quantified in terms of politics of race and gender and class? And what are the implications for that, especially when you are uploading this data onto a cloud bank? And, how are certain bodies allowed to quantify themselves and how are others not? Or how is that mobilized in terms of surveillance? And who has access to actually follow up on that quantification?
That's interesting. So, my limited personal exposure to these people, I've never seen people of color anywhere. And I don't see much representation of that online. Now, in the global context, there are quantified self groups in all continents of the world, so that's a little bit different. But within a kind of North American context, it's a very, very white and middle class. It reflects the sociology of the tech industry to a large extent, even though not everybody's there. So so that's part of it. I'm sorry, but the rest.
I guess just the larger implications of that. So if we're talking about quantified self as in the abstract, but this is also a very racialized class concept of self.
Yes.
And also too, that's the assumption that many people have smartphones and they're able to access their numbers and monitor their numbers. But then what about the next step? What if you're not actually able to gain access to, because the medical expertise almost gets reinserted, right? You have all this set of data, but then what are you supposed to do with it, right?
Yeah.
And so I just think tricky when you're talking about these sorts of questions and we talk about like a larger technological self or a quantified self without remembering the politics that are.
With respect to the kind of that expertise, I mean, part of what many people are after in the quantified self thing is to establish an alternative kind of center, an alternative kind of basis of expertise. So part of what they're interested in doing is meeting with each other and trying to figure out what to do with this data. And they may avail themselves of the expertise of professional scientists and doctors and so on. But they may try and figure it out on their own because the data comes up unique and people do different kinds of experiments. So there's an attempt to kind of build a kind of growing archive of expertise around a whole range of things that stands somewhat apart from what you might find on, say, PubMed or something, or in the standard kind of places where knowledge is developed and stored and so on. Access to that, well, then and then access to that is that's the community. I don't know. It's an interesting question, and how and whether these communities are self-policing, releases the boundaries of who gets in and out. I don't know. I don't know enough. I don't have enough experience to answer that.
Oh, hi. I just was wondering, you mentioned a woman who was a wife of a CEO in Silicon Valley or something.
Yeah, I've forgotten her name.
23. What was that exactly?
So 23andMe is a company that was established a few years ago in the U.S. That you'd send them a DNA sample and they would sequence your entire genome.
Okay.
And then they would give you back your genetic information with full of risk factors for all the different features of your genome. And this long printout with all this kind of stuff. I mean, one of the things that's interesting is that a lot of the stuff that people are doing, the self-tracking stuff that people are doing, of course, isn't genetic. And to some extent, I mean, there's a bit of a gap between what one can actually do with genetic information and what's been promised. A lot of times people are. Well, I'll just leave it at that. So the genetic dimension, it isn't usually genetically focused, a lot of the kinds of things that people are doing, but that's in some sense the kind of the ultimate kind of grail of that. And the worry with 23andMe, it kind of popped up very quickly, started kind of becoming very popular. Lots and lots of people were sending their information. And 23andMe had a clause that in order to avail themselves of your services, you had to contribute your information to the pool. And they made this into a kind of a good citizen thing. You were making a contribution to science and knowledge and so on by handing over your genetic data to the world, into the archive of this kind of thing. Well, some people backed off very quickly and said, I don't want to do that. Other people were quite willing to do so. And but eventually the U.S. Food and Drug Administration stepped in and stopped them from continuing. So they're in the midst of they're in the midst of legal battles. As I said, they moved to Canada. They're moving to the UK very soon, but they've been kind of stopped. But the interesting thing is, they were doing this with kind of basically Google technologies, and the idea was to be the kind of the biological wing of Google at some level, which is a really staggeringly frightening thought. If you think about it, and I'm glad that FDA. Put the brakes on it, at least long enough to kind of think about it, regulate it, get some kind of handle on what's going on before they've already captured all of the data. There was another hand there. Yeah.
Yeah, my comment is actually connected to yours in the back. And I think one of the things that is very disturbing about when you hear about this notion of the quantified self is that it's obviously upheld by normative ordering. And that's something, Foucault would speak to, but I also think that's something that someone like Donna Haraway would speak to, like the informatics of domination.
Yes,
and
yes.
Is that something that you talk about or think about in your research?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, I've just begun to think about this, and apart from rattling around in the back of my mind and reading about it and so on. I mean, it's obviously the critical issue, and but I don't have a kind of handle on how to think about it. I'm afraid. I wish I did, and I hope to eventually. But,
Well, I thought it was interesting in the beginning of your talk you brought up Marx, and I was
Yeah.
also thinking that maybe Lukács would be interesting, the notion of reification coming into the conversation about how capitalism functions in that process of becoming a quantifiable subject. Another element that I notice about the kind of post-human movement is that it has a very strong religiosity entrenched in it. And I felt like you were talking about that a little bit when you spoke about how it grew out of the 60s kind of spirituality, but also the notion that you can control yourself, that you can transcend yourself, and that you can know how your destiny will kind of be fulfilled through this quantification.
Yeah,
It has
yeah.
a very strong kind of religious aspect to
It does. I mean, well, Kevin Kelly, actually, I actually heard a podcast interview with him not so long ago, and he's explicitly religious. He's explicitly a Christian, actually, surprisingly enough, and in both a conventional sense, and he says that he always has been, but also he's got this whole kind of techno-mysticism going. I mean, you notice the book title that was there was called "What Technology Wants." And one of his previous books, which I had read, which was called Out of Control, and it's a similar idea. It's the self-driven kind of. It's some idea that that essentially there's a kind of technological unfolding in all of nature, and kind of so it wants to kind of elide any kind of boundary between the natural world, the biological world, and the technological world, and that sort of thing. So yeah, so that it's full of that. Now, the interesting thing is that he. He's a person who was very close to Stuart Brand and goes back to a kind of faction of people who were very, very influential and have been very influential in Silicon Valley, in some ways in very good ways. I mean, they're the same people who campaign for open source technologies and really, in some sense, made the internet what it is by insisting that the military wanted to have everything kind of as a pre-packaged kind of system with very few constraints, and they basically had a kind of do-it-yourself commune model based on the on the whole Earth catalog, where they kind of believed in the kind of power of individuals and people to kind of invent stuff and kind of contribute it to the collective. And they had the idea that with an open source internet, people would start to do that, and lo and behold, they were right. They also emphasized things like manners in these early online communities, because they had all been living on communes that fell apart because of their lack of any kind of social structure, and they fell prey to demagoguery and infighting and all kinds of weird things. So they had a lot of experience, and so they understood the kind of weird nature of the society, what an online society is, and really created a whole lot of kind of conditions of kind of proper behavior. So very normative in that sense, but against the kind of background of kind of experimentation with social forms that went back several decades. So they're very interesting in this way. But they're kind of, obviously, they're a kind of a thread, but only a thread in the midst of many that are driving this. They're driving this culture.
Just one last
Yeah,
comment. One of the things that I think is very interesting about your paper is that it really gets to this fundamental ethical problem, which is in all of our lives today, which is how much agency do we have in a system, a hegemonic system that is patriarchal, capitalistic, white supremacist? What is our opportunity for agency? And this notion of a quantifiable self, where you seem to be controlling in some sense or measuring who you are, may actually end up subjecting you more.
Yeah.
And that's something like a Foucauldian aspect to it.
Yeah,
But
that's
also Judith Butler has some really interesting things to say about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, good. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, but that's also a very extreme kind of academic brush of fear. I mean, a lot of it is, if I track my carbohydrates and I realize that there's a pattern, if I go under 150 grams, I lose weight. That's a positive. For performance, for athletes, it's been amazing in terms of heart rate tracking.
Right. Yeah.
It actually is empowering in many ways.
I agree. Yeah. No. I
you have to be careful not to,
No, I
What
said
would
that,
the-
and I wanted to emphasize that. What I don't want to do is kind of take a kind of snide, dismissive attitude to this, because, I mean, in this, as in many things, data tells us stuff that we didn't see.
Yeah, you see
Yeah.
patterns which
Yeah.
we didn't before.
Yeah, yeah,
which is
absolutely.
Great individual level.
Yeah, and you know, when you go and if you go online and watch some of these presentations and these people, they've actually solved kind of problems in their lives that are quite real in this sense. So that I'm not, you know, I don't want to dismiss that in a way. It's really this more fundamental issue is what are we doing when we commit ourselves to this kind of model of self-tracking, this data gathering.
Well, it's also
and so
very
on.
early, and there will be many laws that will come. It's the same with Google Glasses, which will, you know,
Yeah,
come out, and you'll be in a washroom and you'll be able to record someone peeing. Well, that's wrong. There will be laws that will come out.
yeah,
Same with commercial drones.
yeah,
There are a plethora of laws coming out now on what drones can do. Can you put a drone in your neighbor's lawn and, you know, and record them bathing? No, you can't.
yeah,
It's
and
very
I
early.
agree, and the laws will come out, but the laws will be shaped by people who have conversations about all this
Yeah.
kind of stuff, and that's
But I think
kind
it's
of,
also
yeah.
not to fear it, which is, you know, I hear a bit here about the fearing of the patriarchal society and this and this. Actually, a lot of it is self-empowering, and, you know.
Yeah, well, yeah, no, it can be, it absolutely can be. I'm interested in there's another kind of, there's another level to it as well, and that's kind of what I'm
You're
trying
right,
to say.
and who will own the data?
Yeah.
It's actually very
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah.
I've got a question, and I piggybacking on things that other people have said, and also from a very fearful standpoint, I admit, and also a hypochondriacal one.
Yeah.
That's unnecessary autobiographical divulgence. You know, like Foucault, you know, he defines biopolitics at one point as the administration of bodies and calculated management of life. And for him, it kind of emerges out of the genesis of statistics, and the ability to do the kind of tracking that you're talking about. And I think it's a really powerful kind of conceptual apparatus for understanding what's going on here, and this kind of dialectic of sort of the attempt to acquire something like agency or mastery on one hand, and then the subversion of that
Yeah.
agency or mastery on the other hand, concomitantly, paradoxically.
Mhm.
But one aspect I think that early models didn't have to contend with as much, and that Foucault doesn't talk about quite as much, is the corporate aspect, the corporate colonization of consciousness, what Stiegler calls psychopower, also piggybacking on Foucault and his notion of biopower. And I know she glossed, and certain people glossed some of these issues and spoke to them a little bit, but I mean, what seems really, and I might be wrong about this, new, is that, you know, sort of the adjunct to something like 23andMe is the ability for companies like Google to market to you based on your assumed genetic proclivities.
Yeah, yeah.
And these kinds of things. And that's it's sort of raison d'etre.
Yeah.
It's its
Yeah.
ability to commodify and also to engender our hypochondrias
Yeah, yeah,
in new,
yeah.
you know, previously unimagined ways.
Yeah, yeah.
And,
Yeah,
and that seems altogether new to me, and I was trying to speak to that.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, you know, I mentioned direct-to-consumer advertising as
Yeah.
that's kind of the carpet bombing approach, I suppose you would say. But I'm sure probably all of us in this room have begun to experience, maybe for some time, this sense of the pop-ups that start to appear on your computer that are kind of manifestations of all your worries because you've Googled things that you were worried about, or, you know, and there they are, kind of screaming at you, just inserting themselves in the middle of a magazine article and all that kind of thing. And that, I mean, that's the personalized direct-to-consumer kind of thing, but in a very kind of insidious way because they're on the margin of the page and they almost appear as though by chance, and then you suddenly, because I think now we're increasingly aware that these things aren't there by chance. That they're, you know, there's feedback, they're tracing you and feeding back to you your interests and so on. So yeah, no, I think I mean it's a complicated loop, and I mean I don't know where it fits. But if the model of the subject that pharma is producing is one of a kind of managed fear, then we're getting this kind of generating this kind of constantly regenerated. System, and I hadn't thought about it in quite that way, but that's really interesting.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, yeah. Right.
So hand in the back. Maybe last question.
Yeah. I just have a question about. So you kind of mentioned sort of hysteria in the late 19th century. to what extent have people tried to quantify psychological states in this movement? And then, so in terms of like the feedback that would be involved in, say, monitoring your mood or some kind of like serotonin level or something like that, and how that might be part of this, and how that might be something maybe more troubling than, say, just monitoring your pulse or your dietary intake or something.
You know, in the online stuff, and particularly in the quantitative self stuff, I find very few attempts, because mood is something that's very hard to quantify in a way. People are often constantly reporting how they felt at various points. They'll show the graphs, they'll show the curves. You know, I felt great here, I didn't feel great here, you know, this kind of stuff. But it's very hard, they don't get that into the data very often. And they're often quite allergic to putting that into data, although it's a constant, you know, particularly with a lot of the kind of health and performance stuff. I don't see it much at all, and it's really striking to me, to the extent that this is a successor to a kind of 70s movement. In some ways it is. In some ways it's very discontinuous. That's one of the ways in which it's very discontinuous. It's very strikingly kind of anti-psychological. They're willing to impute psychology to kind of the evolution of technology, what technology wants, but they're not willing to kind of tolerate psychological variables in people.
I just wanted to speak to that. Is cognitive behavioral therapy, it's a big thing now to do like mood diaries and like all this sort of tracking.
Yeah,
but you're constantly having to reduce your mood to like a number. And it's really, really difficult. Or like mood diaries, it's like how you felt in one day. It's like, well, I felt like this at one point, this at one point. And you're constantly at this wall of having to somehow quantify your emotions, you know.
Yeah.
And it's funny because in these sorts of these therapies, they're constantly giving you sort of questionnaires and charts and this kind of thing, and you're honestly having to kind of like interpret or guess, or it's very resistant. The emotional side is very seemingly resistant to this idea of quantification, I guess.
To sum up your day as a 3 or a 2.
Yeah, like there's some 3s in the morning, maybe a 2 in the afternoon. You know what I mean? Like it's slippery. Yeah, it's really subjective.
Yeah, I don't see much of that in these communities or the bits that I've seen. But it's a very interesting question to see how that's handled, and particularly at those interfaces, because this is a kind of diverse community that has lots of interfaces with other things, and so it's not all together. People aren't altogether standardized. People come at this from different kinds of angles.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you very much. As Dan mentioned, we give this honorary indoctrinator award. It's our version of the honorary doctorate. Steve couldn't join us because his daughter is actually coincidentally playing a police officer in a play right now, but he did record this over Skype, so hopefully the technology will work. It's just 2.5 minutes before we adjourn to the Railway Club.
Good evening, everyone. I'm sorry I can't be there with you tonight, but I am very honored to be receiving the Vancouver Institute for Social Research Honorary Indoctrinator Award. I think I'm very honored to be receiving the award. One concern, of course, is that this may be taken as corroborating evidence of what the oil company Kinder Morgan has been accusing me of. So in court, they've been saying that I controlled protesters to block their pipeline, and that I, in some ways, masterminded what's happened on Burning Man. So, despite concerns of my legal counsel, I think I'm going to accept this award, and I'm going to take it as an honor, and hopefully it can't be used against me in a court of law. So thank you very much to Angela Hall and Dan Edelman, and everybody involved with the Vancouver Institute for Social Research. I hope to indoctrinate many, many more people in the future, so please stay tuned for that. Maybe mostly I've encouraged and invoked more than I've indoctrinated, so I thought I would just offer, by way of thank you, the last stanza of my poem, Come the Revolution. I'm wearing my Come the Revolution t-shirt, which seems appropriate maybe. And yeah, it's maybe not indoctrination, maybe more invocation, but here you are. And it runs like this. Come the revolution, shit will no longer be fucked up in bullshit. And that which is loving in our hands will touch that which is loving in each and every other's hands. And while reading this poem, still won't be the same as storming a bank, oil refinery, or parliament. You may yet be reading this poem to a group of people with whom you will presently be storming a bank, an oil refinery, or a parliament. Thank you very much. I'm going to go off and do some more indoctrination. Take care, everyone. Good night.
That's it. Thank you. You're all graduates of the fall 2014 session of the Vancouver Institute for Social Research.